Welcome back to our Essential series. Today we are going to dive into 2 Peter chapter 2, and as we've talked about, 2 Peter is a distinct letter from 1 Peter, and today's subject is really about false teachers or false prophets, which might not be a subject we're familiar with, so hopefully David and I can shed a little bit of light on this. So David, right off the top, give us some context for this passage.
Yeah, thanks, Malone. So the context of this, again, 2 Peter is written, the clue is at the end of 2 Peter. It's written to people who think the end of times might be near, and they are not, it seems. And so they're wondering what in the world's going on. You know, Jesus hasn't come back. What are we doing here? So they're beginning to doubt. So you have all these sort of exhortations about the gospel, exhortations about how we have the scriptures as a sort of foundation for what we know. And then he shifts into talking about false prophets or false teachers as a way of preparing them for what I think is sort of normal life in the Christian church, which is that don't believe everything you hear, right? And so there's this clear exhortation that there are going to be people who say things that are wrong and not good or healthy and untrue. So be prepared for that.
So within this, do we have any indication who these false teachers might be and what they were up to?
Yeah, we do. So, you know, this is when we use the word pagan talking about the ancient world, we literally mean pagans, not as a metaphor. These are pagan cultures that surround them. Many of them were sort of morally free. The ancient world was also very violent and brutal. And so I do get the sense here that he's talking both about the external world that they live in. There are people who are going to be teaching things that are violent, that are unkind or ungentle, and that are morally ambiguous. And then he also means, I think, people in the church. There are several clues in chapter 2. If you read closely, you'll see these, that he's also talking about people within the church. So it does seem that some of the sort of moral laxity of the surrounding culture has crept into the church, and he's worried about that and concerned about it.
Without chasing this rabbit hole too far, this seems like it could be apropos for today in a way. This is not just for first century. We hear voices of violence and dissension.
Yeah, exactly. No, in that way, it's actually helpful. And we can talk more about this in a minute, but I do think it's helpful to note when the church uses that word heresy, we tend to think like some stuffy thing that no one cares much about. But what they are talking about with wrong teaching is the kind of ideas that are actually damaging to people. So not teaching about like what kind of clothes you should wear, teaching about like fundamental realities of the world that would prompt people to to conduct themselves in ways that would hurt others. Which we have today.
Absolutely. And that leads us then into why Peter really isn't doing a soft shoe here. He's using some pretty strong and potent language as he addresses this.
Yeah, no, I mean, waterless springs, I mean, there are all these examples of, he's not gentle on these people. And I think that's precisely why, is because he knows, actually, Malone, you would remember this, there was a famous bishop who once wrote a book called The Cruelty of Heresy. Heresy, Peter realizes, ultimately is cruel. That is, if you think Jesus is just a person, he's only a moral example, then it means you have to be perfect, which of course is cruel. And nobody can be that. So I think why he's so concerned about this is because he wants people to not believe things that will enslave them. And he uses that language throughout. He doesn't want people to be enslaved to wicked things that will destroy them.
Which then kind of brings us full circle, because our story of redemption is ultimately good news. And we know Jesus, when he unrolls the scroll and reads from Isaiah, says part of that good news is releasing the captives. So talking about this slavery and being enslaved to this, how then is this good news for not only the readers of this letter, but for us today?
Yeah. There's a phrase here in verse 19. Peter says, he's talking about the false prophets. He says, they promise them freedom, that is, others promise freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. For whatever overcomes a person, to that he's enslaved. So I think the positive way of putting that would be, if you believe the truths of the gospel, if you live in such a way that God has made you to love and to live peaceably and to care for those who are weak, it actually is freeing you up to be what you were designed to be. It would be like, we're made in a particular way. It's like you would never use a razor blade as a hatchet. You use a razor blade in a particular way. We're made in a particular way. And once we live into that, we're actually free to be exactly who we're made to be. So I think the hopeful news in this is you peoples who are attracted to wrong teaching, reject it. Don't do it, because if you reject it, it'll actually lead to great freedom, to joy, and to pleasure even.
Well, realizing that this was set in a specific context, but also is applicable, this is a little bit off of the false teachers we're talking about here, but I've always had a sense that for those of us who are ordained in the clergy to have a mindset of not always thinking this is about somebody else, but watching ourselves, and just wonder about your thoughts on that.
Oh, goodness, yeah. I mean, I do think this is as much for those of us who are professional Christians as it is for lay folk. We're just as easily attracted to false teaching as anyone else. And of course, we want people to come along with us. So these are powerful words, I think, for everyone. And I think even while it's challenging at times to read all of these words, it's important to recognize the way in which we live in a particular time, and Jesus has not come yet, just as he's not come in this context. And so beware of things that would lead you astray. Be prepared for the goodness that God has created you for.
And so as we wrap up 2 Peter chapter 2, what's the kind of summation takeaway for us?
Beware of wicked things. There are bad things in the world. There are bad ideas, and there are people who promote those bad ideas, and they're actually sometimes more dangerous than you might think. And the goodness that God has for us, the way he has made us to live, is actually so much more profoundly attractive than we might even imagine. So I do think it's important to not simply focus on the negative here, and that's clear, but to also keep in mind the positive, which Peter will get to later on.
Thanks, David. Well, I hope you enjoy your dive into 2 Peter chapter 2, and that it broadens your perspective of our faith. And until next time, God's peace.